Let's start with supply chain management. Our focus here will be how blockchains are boosting traceability in supply chains. A brief overview of supply chain management. Supply chain management remains one of the most integral aspects of any retail business and their service providers. The processes involve multiple players and numerous transactional records, from transactional records on exchange of goods, financial and payment records, and also custom and regulatory records. A typical supply chain operates in the following format. First, we have raw materials, then suppliers who sell raw materials or partly processed raw materials to manufacturers. Manufacturers then sell to distributors who then get a manufactured product to the consumers. As consumers, we mostly interact with distributors and probably the manufacturers because they brand their products. Nevertheless, the supply chain is always extremely long in certain cases, and it is very hard to keep track of all players in the chain. Just from the sheer number of parties involved, and thus the number of transactions taking place between the players as a good moves from its raw material state to its manufactured form, then to consumers, supply chain generates numerous transactional data and they operate from shared databases. Nothing more complex than a Google Sheet type of database. Alternatively, they operate from individual company data silos as they keep records of the flow of value in the chain as well as contracts and additional documentation. The biggest problem for supply chains is traceability. Due to how data is stored between the players in a supply chain, transparency and traceability are a problem because 1. Data is stored in individual company silos. Every company has its own way of storing data relevant to itself. Thus, it is hard to trace products' transactional data along the supply chain. Imagine if a distributor or consumer wanted to see all the players behind a particular product. It is difficult as all transactional records are stored by companies individually. Therefore, you have to go to the person you acquired it from, trace who they got it from, and so on until you trace the origin. This might seem like a useless thing to do, but tracing origin is key in trying to establish defects or contamination if it's a food or medicine supply chain. Manufacturers suffer most as it is hard to trace back a raw material or partly processed raw material down to the origin if there's already a long chain before the final manufacturing. The second problem, when databases involve multiple players, they are not tamper-proof in spite of competing interests between the different players in the chain. I say that the databases currently employed are not so different from a Google Sheet, for instance. Anyone can add a transaction or edit a transaction. Therefore, if I am a supplier and I delivered a good later than an agreed date as per the sales contract, I would simply edit out that contractual agreement from the public ledger to reduce my liabilities. There are numerous other competing interests in supply chain, and these simple databases are not tamper-proof as data can easily be edited. As a result, poor traceability has made it easier for counterfeit products to get to market. After all, it is hard to trace back the creators and kick them off the value chain. It is even harder for faulty products to be traced back to the origin, particularly unbranded products. A good example of the pains and of poor traceability in supply chain management can be seen well from the E. coli outbreak in the US that contaminated lettuce and spinach. The Food and Drug Administration, that's the FDA, pronounced an outbreak in September 2006. Contaminated foods had to be grounded for 2 weeks in affected states to find the source of the contaminated spinach and lettuce. Very few producers had contaminated produce, but they were affected. Very few producers had contaminated produce, but they affected an entire market for 2 weeks because traceability is cumbersome given the current state of supply chains. For those of us who the only grains we consume are Mountain Dew and guacamole, This doesn't sound like a big deal. But for those of us leading healthy diets, you can imagine the impact of lettuce and spinach being grounded off markets for 2 weeks simply because traceability takes time. Introducing blockchain supply chain management. Instead of the currently inefficient systems, the multiple players in a supply chain can use a permissioned blockchain to store tamper-proof information on transactions and contract fulfillments. A permissioned blockchain is not so different from the public blockchains we've talked about. The only difference is that permissioned blockchains are only open to the involved parties, therefore not just anyone can be a data storage node. Nevertheless, the permissioned players will act as nodes and will store data in the typical distributed decentralized ledger. Even more interesting, blockchains store transactions automatically and with timestamps. Therefore, anyone in the value chain can trace the origin of a product by scanning a barcode or by different means. Anyone in the value chain can assess the raw materials and even view contract fulfillments. In case of contracts, self-executing smart contracts on the blockchain can be added to automate transactional settlements. Let's look at an example of blockchain being applied in supply chain. IBM and Musk are piloting a blockchain supply chain management system for perishable flowers from Kenya's Mombasa port all the way to the port of Rotterdam in Netherlands. Here is an overview of the supply chain. Flowers come from the flower farmers in Naivasha, Kenya. Before they are sent to the port for shipping, the flowers go through regulators and export authorities. In Kenya, these are 3 different institutions that have to conduct that regulatory vetting and customs. Flowers are then taken to the port of Mombasa, from where they are shipped to the port of Rotterdam. Then Rotterdam Customs takes charge before the flowers go to the Holland market. After this whole chain, remember our lecture on trade finance? Bank of Kenya and Bank of Holland are the crediting banks, and they keep track of the flowers, contracts, and financials to conduct settlements after a trade is complete. With blockchains, this whole process is monitored from a distributed decentralized database accessible to all players. When Kenya's customs approves the package of flowers, the approval is updated automatically onto the blockchain. All players in the transaction can see the updated transaction. Once the flowers move from one player to another, that transaction is updated onto the blockchain. Once it is shipped, all players can see exactly when it left the port of Mombasa, exactly when it arrived in Rotterdam. All contracts and documentation are also available in the blockchain ledger. And even crediting banks are participants in the ledger and can track how the goods are moving. This module is a perfect flagship supply chain blockchain system for global trade, given that everything is updated real time and all players can track all transactional data from the distributed ledger, yet tamper-proof blockchain ledger. Here are some of the advantages of blockchains in supply chains. 1. Real-time addition of data and documentation onto the blockchain. 2. Records are tamper-proof as blockchains are immutable. And 3. Blockchains improve traceability and thus efficiency for anyone in the value chain.